Americans eat in a way that no one has ever eaten in the history of humanity. There are many reasons for that. One of the reasons is that we destroyed all the farms that we used to have 50, 60 years ago. There were 4 million more local farms than there are now. The reason that we have no more local farms is because after World War II, in an effort to prevent our country from being invaded, as we had seen in Europe, we built the interstate highway system. Now, it may be a hard stretch to think about the connection between highways and Doritos, but after World War II, we built I-95, which we on the East Coast know, 85, 75, all the way west to I-5 on the West Coast. We built Interstate 90, 80, 70, all the way up and down north-south. We built all the ring roads around the cities. So we had this great infrastructure of big, safe, fast roads, just like the Autobahn in Germany. And what that allowed to happen, it was intended as a homeland security so we could move troops or vehicles around to prevent us from being invaded. If you notice, the highway system is called the Eisenhower highway system, and you'll see little signs on the road that have 5 stars for Dwight Eisenhower. What that allowed to happen, though, was all these vets that were coming back from the war that used to live in the city now realize they could get in a car and drive out to what they used to call the country and build homes. Now, here we are on Long Island. This is one of the first places they built Levittown, for example. So Long Island, among many other places, plowed all its fields. This used to be a place where you grew potatoes. Now there are no potato fields out here. Now it's just suburbs. Where I live in Baltimore, in Maryland, we've lost, in the last 40 years, we've lost 1 million acres of farms and forests. Long Island lost all its farms. I used to live in Atlanta. Atlanta cut down all its forests and tore up all its farms to create some of the fastest growing suburbs in the history of mankind. So what you had were these cities that used to be surrounded by farms. Up until about the 1940s, you had cities and farms. Suddenly you had cities surrounded by rings and rings and rings of suburbs. And what were those suburbs built on top of? They were built on top of farms. So what that meant was that all the food production, we still had to eat. Now that we lived in the suburbs, we still had to find a place to eat. All the food migrated to the Midwest. So instead of having lots and lots of little farms around lots and lots of cities and towns, now you had cities and suburbs and no farms. So all the farms moved to the Midwest, which meant that we started eating in a very different way. The way we started to eat was dictated by the way that these farms got consolidated into fewer and fewer hands. So what you had were very large agricultural companies buying up seeds, buying up land, creating agricultural chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, all this sort of thing. So over time, as the many farms became fewer and the fewer companies became larger, they started to dictate the way that food is made, because it becomes very efficient to make lots and lots and lots of cheap chicken nuggets, for example, in one place and ship them around the country because we've got all these roads like we talked about. So that's the way that the infrastructure of the food system shifted. Now, what that all meant was, instead of people in Maine growing potatoes and eating lobster, and people in Georgia growing collard greens and pinto beans, and people in Maryland eating crabs and whatever, now everybody ate the same thing. Partially because all the food was being made the same and shipped around, and partially because these chain restaurants started to grow up along these roads. So the growth of McDonald's and all these fast food joints, they grew in parallel with these roads because people don't cook anymore. Now people eat in their car or they order out or whatever. So you had all these things coming together. You had the disappearance of local farms. You had the growth of giant farms. You had the growth of the fast food industry, which all meant that food production became centralized. And what that meant in terms of the ingredients of the food, going back to your question, was it turns out that you can take 2 grains, corn and soybeans, and you can break them down and then turn them into all kinds of different kinds of foods. So just for example, when people think about GMOs, they have an idea that we're talking about plants. So they think that they show up in the vegetable aisle of a supermarket. GMOs are not in the vegetable aisle. Where you find GMOs is in the middle of the supermarket, where you have all the junk food, the processed food, the soda, and also in cheap meat, because these grains are turned into processed food and they're turned into feed for animals. So just for example, I think we have Americans eat something like 9 billion animals a year. Those animals are all fed GMO corn and soybeans. All the cheap hamburger that comes from cheap beef, the cattle are fed GMO corn. The chickens are fed GMO soybeans. So the American food system has now become built on two grains, corn and soybean, because all of these big industrial food processors are using these ingredients either to build their food or to feed their animals to build their food. So the American supermarket typically has something like 40,000 different products in it, and you think, you walk into a supermarket, you're like, wow, what a great diversity of stuff. Really, it's all different formulations of these two grains. So what looks like diversity is not diversity, and there are also not that many companies making all this stuff. So one of the things to talk about is the consolidation of companies in power, and also the great reduction in variety and nutritional value of the foods we're eating. So the few companies that control genetically modified foods like to tell the public that they're creating these foods to, what they'll say is, to feed the starving world. The implication is that they have this kind of great humanitarian impulse to feed starving people. Now, this is a great marketing idea, because what it does is it makes people think, oh, they're very altruistic people. That's number one, and also it makes them not think about the fact that what they're really doing is feeding Americans. So it's actually a disingenuous claim, and it's kind of false on both fronts, because they're not only not feeding the developing world, what they are doing is feeding us the wrong kind of food. So as I said earlier, most of the GMOs that go into the food system go into the American food system, not the developing world. And the food that they're feeding Americans is actually like the least healthy, highest calorie, lowest nutrition food that we eat. So we're talking about, like I said, cheap processed chips, soda, fast food. That's what GMOs is creating. Now, it is true that genetic engineering is capable and is in fact doing some work that is beneficial to developing countries. It is not being done by these companies. It is being done by usually university researchers that are doing this with public research money. So there are great stories about researchers who are creating, for example, grains or vegetables that have an increased nutritional profile thanks to genetic engineering. So for example, there are researchers who have been working for decades on something known as golden rice, which is to take a rice plant and change its genetics so that it expresses beta-carotene. So when people eat it, they get vitamin A in their bodies, and a lot of these cultures, especially in Asia, that live rice-based diets are not getting enough vitamin A. So you give them this genetically modified rice, so the theory goes, and now they are no longer giving birth to children that become blind or die when they're young. Now that is seems like a reasonable project. It is not being financed by these big companies. You have other researchers that are doing things like that in Africa, where they're building, there's a root crop in Africa called cassava. We don't eat it much here, but cassava is a very high calorie food that is very common in Africa, and they're also trying to turn on the beta-carotene in cassava. Normal cassava looks white. You add this beta-carotene gene in it and it looks orange, and now people can get both calories and vitamin A. So that is a nutritional enhancement of a product that is being done with genetic engineering. That seems to be a defensible use of the technology. It's not being done by these companies, and you can see why. There's no billion-dollar market in cassava for poor farmers in Africa. Where the money is in getting more junk food into Americans, and increasingly, I should say, more junk food into other countries. So you're starting to see these companies now in a very unsettling way pushing into South America, for example, in both ways, both in the production of this kind of food and the marketing of the food products. So in places like Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, these companies are going in there and they're having rainforests cut down, which of course we can't afford given climate change, replacing the rainforest with these monocultures of corn and soybeans in order that they can then create more cheap meat and cheap processed food. Now, the cultures down there are being subjected to massive marketing campaigns. So you see people pushing wheelbarrows through these poor villages trying to get people to eat Doritos and drink Coke and eat Nestle's and all this just because they've got to expand their market somehow. The American diet is already saturated with this stuff. Now they're trying to expand it into the South American market. So the problem with this is that these companies have a lot of control and a lot of power and economic might, but they're pushing the wrong kind of stuff both on the United States and now around the world as well. That is a myth. It is not. It's true at a very small level. I mean, if you take the number of GMO crops that are being nutritionally enhanced to benefit developing countries, that is true, and it is also a tiny, tiny, vanishing fraction of the total genetic modification of food generally. The vast, vast majority of genetically modified food is being dumped on the American diet and now increasingly on the global diet. It is the opposite of nutritionally dense food. It is calorie dense food. It makes people fat, this stuff. It does not increase their health. So it is true that the engineering, the technology can be used to make nutritionally enhanced food or drought resistant crops or flood resistant crops. That is true, but that is in the scale of all of the food industry, a tiny fraction of what is actually happening. So a lot of the companies that we're talking about got their start as chemical companies making, in many cases, chemicals for warfare. So if you think about the way that DuPont or Monsanto or Bayer or BASF or Syngenta, a lot of these companies started out making chemicals that were used to make explosives, for example, or to make chemicals that were used as defoliants. Explosives if we're talking about World War II, defoliants if we're talking about Vietnam. They were very good at making chemicals that were good at blowing things up or killing plants. So once these wars were over, these companies had these huge stockpiles of chemicals and a decline in their market because now the army wasn't buying them anymore. So they had to figure out ways to sell these things. So they started coming up with great strategies to sell these chemicals to both to farmers and to homeowners. So, for example, herbicides, the things that are made to kill plants, in this case they're called weeds, but let's just call them plants. These chemicals kill plants. You can sell them to soldiers who need to, burn down forests in Vietnam, or you can sell them to farmers to kill weeds, or you can sell them to homeowners to kill weeds. So it's very interesting to look back at the marketing strategy. So they convinced farmers that rather than doing the age-old practice of, pulling weeds, which humans have been doing for thousands and thousands of years, or tilling them up, now you could just spray everything. That will kill everything. That was considered to be a labor-saving device, which it was. It was seen to be a great advancement in technology. The problem is, of course, is all those chemicals immediately kill the biological integrity of the soil, and as soon as it rains, all those chemicals go into the rivers and go into our drinking water, and of course have a very deleterious effect on aquatic life, fish and aquatic plants and everything else. It also enters the food chain because once we eat the fish, we get those chemicals in our body. That's one thing. To homeowners, they said, we've got all these chemicals that'll magically kill everything except your grass. Now, as we talked about earlier, the United States suburbanized like crazy. And in addition to houses, Americans became obsessed with their lawns. Like they had their house and they had their lawn, and suddenly the lawn became this like outdoor carpet. And it became this weird status symbol. Like you had to have this perfect lawn that was perfectly mowed and perfectly groomed and perfectly weeded, or else your neighbors might think you were somehow like, a threat or something. In fact, if you go back and look at the early Levittown newspapers from like the 1960s, I'm not even exaggerating about this. You can find newspaper articles from Levittown that said like, that neighbor of yours who has an unruly lawn might be a communist. Like they were equating like a crazy lawn with a crazy person or something. So like there became this peer pressure for all these new suburban homeowners that your lawn was you. Like you had to present your lawn as the outer representation of your personality, your family, or whatever it is. In other words, if you didn't mow and spray, you were somehow like a suspicious character, which is a great strategy for these companies because they can, of course, then turn around and sell you these products that will make your lawn look exactly like your neighbor's. So what they were able to do was, for example, come up with a product that could kill all the clover in your grass. Now, I don't know about you, but clover happens to be a really soft, happy little plant that if you run around, your kids run around on bare feet, no problem. Problem is that clover, when it flowers, also attracts bees. So what these companies did, because bees love clover flowers, these companies said, are your kids getting stung by bees? If so, we can solve that problem. We can sell you a product that will kill the clover, which will get rid of the bees, and now your kids won't get stung by bees. People are like, oh, that sounds great. I don't like bees. I don't like my kids getting stung by bees. So they buy this product, spray it on their grass. It kills all the clover. Trouble is, now we have no more bees. So bee colony collapse is directly a result not only of these poisons that we're putting on our lawns, but also the destruction of their food source. That's one problem. The other problem is that clover happens to be what's known as a nitrogen fixer. Like clover grows in your lawn, it pulls nitrogen out of the atmosphere, puts it in the soil, that helps everybody grow. Grass doesn't do that, clover does. So you kill all the clover, now you've got nitrogen deficient soil. So what these companies do is they turn around and say, are you having problems with nitrogen deficiency? Well, we can sell you this fertilizer. That's what fertilizer is. Fertilizer is a way to put nitrogen into your soil. So when you see these companies telling you that you need to spray herbicides and fertilize your lawn, you actually don't need to do either. You can just let clover grow. It'll mean you don't have to spray herbicides, and it'll keep your soil healthy. So instead of buying 0 products, now you have to buy 2. And once it rains, all that stuff washes into the river, and now we've got that problem. So that's the backstory. So these companies started as chemical weapons companies, then they started as agrochemical companies and lawn care chemical companies. So they have all these chemicals, they're spraying them all over the place, and then they discover that you can create seeds that even if you spray them with these chemicals, the plants will still grow. So the way that these GMOs evolved was that the scientists figured out at the company's behest that they can create a plant that will grow into a crop, and you can spray the crop with these chemicals. It'll kill everything except for the GMO seed or the plant that you've created. So one of the big criticisms of GMOs is that what they really are is a delivery system for these chemicals. Because if you can convince all American farmers to plant this kind of seed, then they will naturally buy all the chemicals. So GMOs can be marketed as this or that, but certainly the way they are used is a way to convince farmers not only to plant these seeds, but to then spray all their crops with these herbicides and insecticides. So that's one of the big suspicious things, is that this is really just a vehicle to keep their market for chemicals running high. Well, think about this. You used to go on a road trip and you could drive for 4 or 5 hours and your windshield would be covered with bugs. That doesn't happen anymore. There are no more bugs, and that actually is a really bad development because bugs are the baseline of the food chain for birds. So what you're finding is massive bird population crashes because there's no more food. Like this idea that we can somehow chemically sanitize the world, like we don't like mosquitoes or something, so we create these bug killers that kill mosquitoes, but they kill everything else too. And you don't want to live in a clean room, you want to live in an active, alive biosphere, and we have just like completely obliterated some things with this. There are 2 large categories of GMO crops in the United States. One is called Bt corn, which is it's a corn that has a bacteria gene inserted into it that serves as an insect repellent. That's one thing. So you can put a gene in a corn plant that will make the plant unattractive to corn borer insects. Then there's another category which is to kill, as we said before, GMOs that will survive even when you spray them with things that kill plants, weeds. So one resists insects, one stands up even though you spray it with herbicide. So the theory is that if you can create corn plants with a gene inserted into them that makes them unattractive to insects, you will then not have to spray insecticides on them. That turns out to be true. Like what's called Bt corn requires lower use of insecticides because in essence, the corn itself is an insecticide because it has the gene of an insect repellent bacteria in it. Now, people who grow organic food still don't like that. They say even if it's true that BT corn uses less insecticides, you're still eating a genetically altered crop that has been engineered to make it repellent and even deadly to insects. So then when you eat the corn, you're getting that insect repellent in your diet. So organic farmers, even though it reduces the amount of insecticides, they still don't like it. And I should say, organic farmers, BT itself is a naturally occurring bacteria in the soil. And organic farmers can spray, sort of sounds strange because it sounds like I'm confusing things, but an organic farmer is legally allowed to spray a naturally occurring bacterium called BT on top of their crops, and they've long done that to create insect resistance. What GMOs have done is taken that same bacteria and stuck it inside the genes of the plant. So you're not spraying it on the plant, you're inserting it in the plant. And I have spoken to organic farmers that say spraying a naturally occurring insecticide on top of the corn is something I can live with and is in fact legal under organic rules. Inserting it into the plant is something I would never do, and it is not legal under organic standards. The idea being that the BT bacteria that keeps the insects away will wash off and is natural and non-toxic to the human diet. Therefore, it's okay and legal under organic standards. Inserting it into the plant means that when you eat it, you're going to ingest it. That's the argument on BT. The other side, the herbicide, that is to say the plant-killing chemicals that are used to create, for example, Roundup-ready soybeans, those are sprayed on the plants to kill the weeds and allow farmers to grow these crops without having to weed them. So if you take those two things, the weed killers and the insect resistors, and total them all up, it turns out we're actually using more. We're using, I think it's about 7% more total chemicals. Even though the BT is reducing it, the weed killers is so high that it actually outstrips. So the argument that we're using fewer chemicals is actually not true, because the weed killers outstrip the insect killers. So the primary chemical that people talk about most when we're talking about the chemicals sprayed on GMOs is known as glyphosate, which is the weed-killing component in a product most commonly known as Roundup. So any homeowner can walk into any Home Depot or any hardware store and buy Roundup, and many people use them on their gardens to kill weeds, and farmers use it in very large quantities. Now, for a very long time, glyphosate, that is to say Roundup, was marketed as a benign, that is to say a fairly safe herbicide. And certainly, it was said, safer than the alternatives, which were older and much more toxic. So for a long time, people said, look, Roundup is fine, it's been approved by the EPA, it's safe, it's certainly safer than the other things, so just stop worrying about it. That was not a universal opinion, and in fact, in recent years, there have been increasing studies that are now suggesting that Roundup is actually considerably more dangerous than we were led to believe. There's a United Nations health study that says, and has now declared, that Roundup is or I should say glyphosate, is a probable human carcinogen, which is a technical term, not a possible, but a probable human carcinogen. So if this chemical, which is sprayed on millions of acres of crops around the world, is now a probable human carcinogen, that is a totally different can of worms. So the product that we were told was the benign product is now turning out to be a probable human carcinogen. That becomes a serious issue. There is also quite a number of legal cases now asking companies like Monsanto the same questions that people were asking the tobacco companies, which is like, what did you know about this, and when did you know it, and what did you tell us, and what didn't you tell us? And there seems to be an increasing body of evidence that these chemicals may have been more dangerous than we were led to believe for a very long time. So that's part of it. The other part of it is now that we have used this chemical so widely and for so long that the plants and the crops that we're spraying with them are becoming resistant to them. So they're starting to evolve, just as the way nature always works. generation after generation after generation of plant is subjected to something, it will eventually evolve to survive it. And when you spray a particular chemical on weeds for 30, 40 years, eventually the weeds are going to figure out a way to grow and survive it, and they're starting to do that. So you've probably heard the term super weeds. There are these plants now that you can spray with glyphosate. It used to kill them and no longer does. So it's almost like what happens when you have antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Like what happens when you use it and use it and use it until finally, these things evolve very quickly, very, very quickly. There are many, many, many generations in a very short amount of time, always trying to figure out ways to survive. That's the way evolution works. What happens when you have antibiotic-resistant bacteria? This is where people start getting apocalyptic, because suddenly, it used to be you get sick, you take an antibiotic and you're fine. If you take the antibiotic and you're no longer fine, then you've got no other place to go. So if you start developing these chemical onslaughts and then evolution occurs, so now that these weeds will grow despite that, there's no way to control them. So what they start doing now is using more and more toxic versions to replace the glyphosate, which no longer works. So now we're back to where we were before, which is using lots and lots of really acutely toxic things. So this whole kind of merry-go-round of using chemicals is inevitably just going to make things more and more and more toxic, because that's just the way things work. Plants evolve. We need to use heavier and heavier artillery to get rid of them. So it's true in the smallest sense, but as soon as you pull the lens back, it becomes less and less true and less intelligent. Well, this goes back to the question about whether GMOs are being used to help the developing world. So in the developing world, the kind of GMOs that are helpful are the ones that support farmers trying to grow in very difficult, oftentimes climate-influenced conditions. So there is research being done, for example, on genetically enhanced crops that can survive in periods of intense drought, for example. There's a story that's worth talking about, which is the banana. So like every banana that you've ever eaten, no matter where you are in the United States, and pretty much no matter where you are in the world, unless you live in the tropics, is one kind of banana. It's called the Cavendish banana. So whether you're in LA or New York or London or Hong Kong, wherever you're eating a banana, it's a Cavendish banana. So it's called a monoculture, so we grow one kind of crop. Now, again, thing about evolution, what happens is just like with human beings, there are always bugs out there trying to pick the lock of our immune system. Just like with plants, there are always things trying to eat plants, not just people, but other things. So when you have a diversity of crops, if a bug, a virus, or a fungus, or whatever it is, figures out how to get in and infect one, it might affect every single one of one kind of crop, but if there's a diversity of crops, it'll only affect one, not all the others. When you plant only one kind of crop, in this case around the world, and something figures out how to get in there, it can wipe out the entire global crop. And what's happened with the banana is there's a certain kind of fungus that has picked the lock of the Cavendish banana. So bananas around the world are dramatically under the threat of being wiped out because there's only one kind of banana, and this fungus has figured out how to pick the lock of its defenses. So there are genetic engineers scrambling to figure out, can you make a GMO banana that will resist this fungus? And we'll see whether they do or not. It's worth pointing out that the reason we only have one kind of banana is because this is an industrial banana. Like the reason we have the banana that we have is not because it's the tastiest. It isn't the tastiest. It's because it's the one that ships the best. So every American knows that when you go into the supermarket to buy bananas, they typically are green. That's because they were cut in the tropics when they were unripe, put on a boat or a truck or a plane and shipped around the world green. They get in your supermarket and they have to sit there or on your kitchen counter for a week or 10 days until they get ripe. Now, that's not the way people are supposed to eat. They're supposed to eat ripe fruit, not unripe fruit. But the reason they are green is because they've got a nice fat, thick skin. So in other words, like the reason we have monoculture bananas is because we have an industrial need to eat one kind of banana. It's very impractical to pick these beautiful, ripe and exotic bananas in a place like Costa Rica and try to get them to New York because they won't get there. They're going to rot before they get there. So either we eat no bananas or we eat industrial bananas. If we insist on eating industrial bananas, eventually we're not going to have any because we've got this global system. So that's a long way around to say that that is an industrial, or that is a use of genetic engineering that could help save a particular plant that a lot of people like. But you have to remember that the reason we eat them in the first place is because it's the only kind of banana that can ship. So then to go back to the question, can GMOs help small farmers? Most of the time you hear that applied to small farmers in the developing world. Can GMOs help small farmers in the United States? In my book, Food Fight, I do interview a small farmer in Maryland who makes that claim. She says, by using, in her case, things like BT corn, I can reduce my use of herbicides. And she says, my goal is not to be non-GMO. My goal is to be sustainable. And she actually has a really vested interest in having sustainable systems of agriculture. And it's her claim that GMOs can be a part of that. But she's not growing 50,000 acres of corn. She's functioning on a small farm with a diversity of crops, using a little bit of GMO, a little bit of herbicide, and it's her idea that this all can work in the direction of sustainability. I don't think that's a universal opinion, but I think it's a perfectly plausible opinion. Are GMOs safe to eat? That is a question that a lot of people have a lot of very strong opinions about. I will leave it to others to talk about the science of GMOs. In other words, if you eat plant A that is GMO and plant B, is it non-GMO? The industry will tell you that billions and billions and billions of meals have been eaten with GMOs and nobody has ever gotten sick. As I understand it, that is an undefensible position because we do know that people get sick all the time, and many times that people get sick, we don't really know what the cause is. So there's no clear evidence. That's when they say billions of meals have been eaten and nobody's gotten sick, that is what is known as anecdotal evidence. We don't know how many GI distresses, how many things like, any of these GI issues which are spiking all over the place, whether it's celiac or gluten intolerance, all this stuff that people call, who knows what that is coming from. We do know that very, very few human studies have ever been done on this. So the fact of the matter is there's not been anywhere near enough research into this question to prove that what they say is true. So let's just take that as a claim that I have no particular confidence in. But for my purposes, a bigger question is to ask, are eating the foods made out of GMOs healthy or unhealthy? And that to me is absolutely clear cut because we have to remember what we're talking about. We're talking about foods, we're talking about ingredients, GMO ingredients that are being used to make foods that are without question unhealthy. Because number one, they are by definition sprayed with chemicals, which is not what you want. Definition two is that they're used to make processed food and cheap meat, which is making nobody healthy. It's not making humans healthy, it's not making animals healthy, it's not making rivers healthy. So the junk food and the processed food, the fast food that is coming out of GMOs is unhealthy regardless of whether the GMO itself is making you sick. What's wrong with corporations controlling our food? The centralization of power is never a good idea, no matter what you're talking about. When you have, I'm just speaking about the centralization of power, period, whether it's governments or corporations. When you have a centralization of power, you also have a centralization in the control of information, for example. So if our food supply rests in the hands of very few companies, and something occurs that is negative for those companies, whether it's like an E. coli outbreak or a cancer cluster or people getting sick from eating a certain kind of food, if it's not in that company's interest for people to know about it, they will suppress that information. So, there was a very famous story 10 years ago or so where Oprah Winfrey, in response to yet one more outbreak of E. coli, got on her show and says, I will never eat another hamburger. And she got sued. Believe it or not, these companies said that she was libeling food. Now, that was the first time, I teach journalism. I'd never heard of food being able to be libeled. Like, libel is about ruining a person's reputation. I didn't know that hamburgers had a reputation in terms of the Constitution, but apparently, this was up for debate. Now, thankfully, Oprah was really rich and she won her case. But this is kind of a case in point. It's like if someone gets up there and says something negative about hamburgers, and those companies are extremely rich and extremely politically powerful, and they don't want that information to be disseminated, they will squash it either through lawsuits or through threats or through media campaigns or whatever it is. So when you concentrate control in the hands of very few players, there's no dissent. And you don't want that. I mean, not to get all philosophical here, but democracy, like by definition, is a collection of different voices. And if you have one voice that is shutting out everybody else, bad things happen. There's like a long historical record of that, whether you're talking about politics or talking about food. So you don't want, at the political level, you don't want everything concentrated in a few places. There are lots of other ways to talk about this, though, of course, which is like, if you look at, as we said earlier, if the diet is based on basically two grains, corn and soybeans, there used to be hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of foods out there. So like, our diet is not benefiting from having the concentration. The environment is not. There are 200 million acres of corn and soybeans, and that's 200 million acres fewer forests and fewer broccoli crops and fewer carrots and apples and everything else. All that stuff has been wiped away to create this tiny, tiny concentration of stuff. So it doesn't work politically, it doesn't work nutritionally, it doesn't work environmentally, like it works at no level. There's nothing to balance that power. I mean, balance of power is, it's not only a politically desirable thing, balance is actually the way nature works. Nature doesn't, left to itself, nature doesn't say, you know what, I think we should have all corn. Like, that's just not the way it works. Like, people should be much more interested in mimicking the way the natural world works, not trying to control it to suit our own corporate ends. That's the opposite of the way nature works. So a lot of people wonder why everyone's worked up about GMOs, because they must be safe because somebody in the government must have approved them or must have tested them. And it's a very important thing for people to understand that government agencies are very large. And whether Republicans or Democrats are in office, sometimes they want those agencies to be bigger, sometimes they want them to be smaller. But whether they're big or small, they're still enormous. And they are run, that is to say, they are organized and directed by political appointees. So, whether you're talking about the EPA, the USDA, the FDA, these are giant bureaucracies that have many career scientists working for them at the middle and lower levels. But at the top, they have people appointed by whoever happens to be the president. So the director of the EPA, the director of the USDA, these are people that are appointed by political people. So who is a president going to appoint to run these agencies which are responsible for protecting our food and our water and our chemicals and everything else? Well, the president gets into office and he's got all these agencies he's got to appoint people to. Well, who's going to tell him, where's he going to get his recommendations about who to appoint? He's going to get his recommendations from the industries that are regulated by these companies. So if you have a company that makes chemicals, they're going to want their guy appointed to the head of the regulatory agency. If you've got a company that makes food, you're going to want their guy appointed to the USDA. This happens regardless of who's in office, whether it's a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican. They come into office and the companies come in and they tell them who to appoint. Because the president doesn't know everybody, like he just knows a few people. Everyone else is telling him who to appoint. So the problem with this regulatory system we have, because it's politically determined, is that you have people in charge that don't have consumers' interests at heart, they have companies' interests at heart. So I wrote a book called Poison Spring a few years ago with a guy who used to work at the EPA. And he pulled 1,000 different documents out of the EPA over the course of 25 years, and it was like completely evident that from like in his case, from like the early Reagan administration all the way through Obama, the EPA was dictated to at every level by the corporations they were supposed to be regulating. So this idea that these government regulators are somehow looking out for regular people is unfortunately a myth. I mean, the scientists are trying to do the best they can. And what's really aggravating about this is these scientists do really great research, and then they come up and they'll say things like, you know, we've done all these studies and it turns out that this chemical is really dangerous. And they'll say, I think we should tell the public. And then the people at the top say no. And they bury it, or they kill it, or they defund it, or they move those researchers around so it never gets out. So the problem is that you've got scientists doing good work and political appointees that are squashing the science, so then the public never gets to hear about it. So, you know, the conservative political voice says we want to deregulate, meaning they don't trust government to regulate business. They would like business to regulate itself. That's a bad idea because business doesn't regulate itself. The liberals want government to regulate things, which seems fine, except that even with liberal administrations, you still have corporate people at the top of these agencies. If you look at the way that the revolving door works between corporations and these, it's just like a constant merry-go-round. So this idea that anybody is looking out for our best interests is really, it's misplaced confidence, let's say. So, as we've spoken about before, this incredibly dense and long-term reliance on glyphosate, Roundup, has meant the decreasing effectiveness of Roundup. So what companies are doing now is creating what are called stacked herbicides, which are they're taking glyphosate and then adding another chemical called, for example, 2,4-D. 2,4-D used to be a component of Agent Orange. So now you can buy a stacked herbicide that has both. And use that because now we are going to ramp up the effectiveness of this now compound chemical. This is just another, you know, unintended but logical consequence of the resistance to glyphosate. You're starting to get these layers of more toxic chemicals to be used by farmers. And you know, the regulator said these are fine because we've already had 2,4-D on the market, we've already had glyphosate on the market, so what could possibly be the problem of stacking them up? This just goes back to my earlier point that the chemicals we're using are becoming more and more acute and more toxic. This is a really great question. So if GMOs are in virtually all the food that we eat, and yet nobody knows that, one of the big pushes by food activists is to put a label on food that says, this food contains GMOs. And the reason that activists are doing that is because the term GMO has become a toxic term. Like people, whether they know anything about GMOs or not, they have this weird or kind of intuitive sense that it must mean that things are bad. It's like, you know, in the 70s, the term MSG, like you went to eat Chinese food, if it had MSG, you didn't want to eat it. You didn't even know what it was, you just didn't want to eat it. So the labeling question is really interesting because there are lots of words that are attached to packages of food. Some of them are legally required, most of them are not. So for example, if you see the word natural on your, whatever it is, your cereal, it has no meaning. It is a marketing term. There's no legal terminology. If you see the word organic, it is a legal term. Like that, or the word organic is one of the very few things that has legal power, which means that this product was made with no synthetic chemicals. So labels mean things to people. So food activists have decided, rightly, that the term GMO is a negative marketing label. So they, because they don't like GMOs, would like to force companies to put a GMO label on all food. Now companies, knowing that the word GMO is toxic, don't want this label. So they are pouring millions and millions of dollars. Whenever there's a state like California or Vermont or whoever it is that says we want to label food, they pour millions of dollars saying no, 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 no. And so far they've been successful. What's happened instead of that is that companies voluntarily are putting non-GMO labels on their products because they know that non-GMO is the opposite of a toxic. It's a draw. So you buy cereal and it says non-GMO, you're like, oh good, I don't want GMOs, I'll buy this. So what's interesting about that is that, you know, whenever you're fighting things, there's always like the political game and then there's like the marketing game or the consumer game. So you can either play this game at the political level or you can play it at the marketing level. So the political game is where the power has been for these food companies, and they squash it and squash it and squash it. The marketing campaign, if you're a little startup company and you put non-GMO and suddenly people start buying it, that's a way to take market share away from these big companies. This is what happened with the organic food movement. You know, people are suddenly like buying organic, you know, or not just organic produce, but organic spaghetti sauce or organic wine or whatever it is, and now that's starting to cut into the profits of the regular companies. What's funny and weird about this is now that you can have a big company that makes, for example, Cheerios, and they can say Cheerios non-GMO, and they'll be right on the shelf next to Honey Nut Cheerios, which does not say non-GMO. So you're a parent walking down the supermarket, and you're like, which one do you pick? And the company has to make this calculation like, okay, so if we sell the non-GMO product and that cuts away from some of the regular GMO product, that's okay because we're still selling something. But what happens if we start losing market share to our own products? Like, it's very complicated for them. So the labeling question is a very interesting one. And I also will say one further thing. And I will tell you that this is the kind of thing that my book is really about, which is about things that are way beyond just the question of GMOs. So let's say you would like to know more about your food. The fact that you don't know anything about your food is itself revealing about where we are in the world. Like, there have only been like 3 or 4 generations of human beings on the planet that didn't know where their food came from. We just happen to be one of them. Like it used to be, think about your grandparents or maybe your great-grandparents. Somebody in your recent family history either was a farmer or knew a farmer. Everyone was like that. And then suddenly we have generations where nobody knows a farmer, can't even find a farm on a map. So therefore our ignorance about food is like complete. And people don't like that because, you know, they buy something, they don't really know where it came from, so they would like some information about it. This is also part of the labeling question. So if you would like to know more about your food and you can't find a farm to save your life, the best you can hope for is something that's on the package. So what would you like on that package? Like, what would you like to know about your food? Whether or not it's a GMO, is that all you want to know? Like, what would you like to know, like how the workers were treated at the farm, or how the animals were treated at the farm? Or, you know, let's say, you know, yuppies these days, they love to eat almonds. Almonds is a big thing. Everyone's eating almonds. Would you like to know that almond plantations in California are some of the most water-intensive crops on the planet? So like to eat a single nut, one single almond requires a gallon of fresh water. Let's say you eat 40 almonds a day. That's like a bathtub full of fresh water that you ate because you like almonds. Would you like that to be on the label? Like, would you like to know that growing almonds is a very water-intensive crop? And maybe you're like, you know, actually the biggest problem in the world is the decline in drinking water. So maybe almonds is a complicated thing to eat. Like, what is it that you want to know? So there are people, and this is true of pro-GMO and anti-GMO people, that said, you want a label? The label's going to have to be like 10 feet long because food is complicated and we don't know anything about it. So what is it that you want to know? It can't really just be about GMOs. So I think the labeling conversation is more complicated and more interesting than either side makes it. If you have a food product and you poke your phone at it and suddenly all these videos come and tell you everything you want to know, how the workers are treated, how the animals are treated, how the soil is treated, whether chemicals are used, all of it. That might seem like a crazy, like futuristic, postmodern, yuppie thing, which it is because it's all digital. But what it also is simply a digital reflection of the way it used to be, which is you want to know what your food is like, you walk down and you ask the farmer. So it's digital, but it's also weirdly like retro because, you know, the reason you can't go down the street and ask your farmer how he's growing his food is because you don't have a farmer anymore. If you did, you would, and you wouldn't need all this technology. So it's a crazy kind of back to the future thing where we're trying to like reproduce what used to be true for everybody. The weird thing about this, human beings have been farming for about 10,000 years. Before that, we were hunter-gatherers for a very long time. And on a clock, if you take all of human existence as a 24-hour clock, we've been farming at all for about 6 minutes. So for 23 hours and 54 minutes, we were running around hunting and gathering fruits and nuts and whatever. Then 6 minutes ago, we decided to farm, which is to say 10,000 years ago. So if 10,000 years equals 6 minutes, what percentage of 10,000 years is this whole GMO industrial food thing? We're talking about 50 or 60 years. We're talking about like a flash of time. And we don't have any idea what we're doing. I mean, we think we do because we're all geeky about science and we think science is like religion or something. But the fact is this is in the scale of things, is a brand new and completely unprecedented thing. So when anybody says, I know that this stuff is safe or I know that this stuff is beneficial, you know, on its face you can say that's just completely unknowable because it's all brand new. I think we just had the Super Bowl thing. What is the Super Bowl? The Super Bowl is a bunch of guys on a field to get you to watch an endless stream of ads for Coke and Doritos and, you know, Jeeps and whatever else. It's just you know, we live in a world where everybody is competing for our attention so they can sell us stuff. That's like we've become like a country of consumers and like wallets with legs, you know. So everybody's marketing, pushing, trying to get us, and it's like really difficult to figure out, like, with all this noise trying to get us to buy stuff, like what to do. So, I mean, that's a much bigger can of worms. It's not just food, it's everything, but that's where we are. I think this is, to me, one of the most important questions, and the one that I think has some really exciting, and if I even dare say fun, possibilities. So I mentioned before that one of the big structural problems is that we used to have, in this country, as Europe still does, we used to have cities surrounded by farms. They say that like in the 19th century, more than 50% of everyone in the country worked on a farm. So 50% of the people you knew worked on a farm. Now it's 2%. So nobody works on a farm, nobody knows where any farms are. So that's the problem. The solution to this is returning to that, returning to local food production, local food economies. So you are watching now, you know, we've had 25 or 30 years of a boom in organic food because people got sick of the chemicals. Now what you're starting to find is a boom in local food, local small-scale food. And, you know, again, cynics will say, oh, that's just yuppies. Yuppies have money so they can spend it on local boutique. But that's false, because what that is actually just simply returning to the way things always were. Like this last 50, 60 years thing is a complete historical aberration. Eating big industrial food is not, I mean, the term you hear is it's conventional farming. That is a false title. The way we eat now is a historically unprecedented way. So when people say, I would like to eat food grown by a farmer whose name I know, that's actually, and if you want to think about it this way, a conservative idea because it's old school. That's the way it always used to be. So whether you live in the suburbs and there happens to be one last farm, you know, everything else has been plowed under to make subdivisions and there's one guy who's growing food, you want to give that guy your money. Like you want to make that guy the richest guy in town. Why? Because if he gets rich, people are going to be like, huh, you can make a buck farming, and maybe what we'll do is not create one more shopping mall, maybe we'll create one more small farm, and now this local economy starts to grow. You're starting to see this in cities, especially in blighted, you know, really challenged places like where I live in Baltimore, or in places like Detroit, or places like Milwaukee or Chicago. There are brilliant people that are taking these abandoned neighborhoods in cities, and they're not just creating gardens, they're creating farms. Because cities, as you know, have just been brutalized because this is a whole conversation, but when we built the roads and everybody left the city to go out and live in the suburbs, the cities collapsed. You know, with few exceptions. New York City, San Francisco, places that have like unmanageable real estate prices, those places didn't suffer so much. But where I live, Baltimore, Detroit, these other cities, they were gutted. When everyone left, they took the money with them and the cities fell apart. So that created all kinds of problems, and not just food, but all kinds of racial problems and economic disparity problems. All kinds of ugly things happened when all the money left the cities. What is happening now is these cities are reinventing themselves. So you've got people moving back into the cities and say, you know what we want to do is feed ourselves. And they come into these neighborhoods that have what are called food deserts, where they've got, you know, the only place to buy food is at a McDonald's or a bodega, like a corner store that's got no fresh produce. And they're saying, you know what, this is not helping anyone. So they're creating really interesting, very innovative ways to grow food. So that, to my mind, this is the solution, is to reinvest in local food production. And I will tell you, as someone who teaches at the university, I always take my students, and I'm talking about like English majors and history majors and philosophy majors, I take them out to farms and reintroduce them to the making of food. Because even college students, you ask them where like potatoes come from, and they might say they grow on trees. They don't know because they've never seen one. They think of potatoes as a chip or a fry. You know, they think strawberry is a flavor because they've never seen one growing. Does anybody know where a strawberry comes from? Does that grow on a tree? Does it grow on a vine? They've never seen one. How are they going to know? You introduce them to that, and they're like, ah, God, now I know. Now I'll never eat another industrial strawberry again. Yeah, so the consolidation of seeds mirrors the consolidation of power that we were speaking about earlier. So if you're a company and your business model is to create a very few number of seeds and make every farmer buy them, then eliminating their choices is in your best interest. So what you had were these companies that used to be chemical companies are now creating GMO seeds. What they did was they ran around and they bought up all these independent seed companies. So now, if you look at the varieties of seeds that are available to farmers, where you used to have hundreds of varieties, now you have 4 or 5. And this is a problem at multiple levels. It's a problem for our diet, because now we have a dramatic decline in the diversity of kinds of foods that we're eating. It also happens to be a very serious environmental problem, because as we talked about before, when you replace a diversity of plants with very few plants, you are creating a biologic desert. I mean, these places, like a cornfield, is not a whole lot more ecologically healthy than a parking lot, because what it is nutritionally damaged soil growing the same crop year after year after year after year, with chemical saturation from the herbicides and chemical saturation from the synthetic fertilizers. So the soil is dying, the water that runs off these farms is dying, all because of this monoculture. Monoculture meaning a very small number of seeds planted on millions and millions of acres. So this is a problem at a lot of levels. These seeds become corrupted by a virus or bacteria or drought, whatever it is, and they get wiped out and there's nothing to replace them, then we are like seriously screwed. So this is true for social, in a human context and in a biological context. Diversity is what you want. You know, I always kind of joke with my students that like monoculture is like the equivalent of like white supremacy. Like you don't want that. Bad things happen when you only give power to corn. You don't want a world where corn dominates. I mean, because actually corn has like taken over the American landscape. That's a bad idea. So you want diversity in all things. That's the way nature wants it to be. It wants it to be diverse and rich and interconnected. Ask an American what they want from their food, and they will say they want it fast and they want it cheap. Now, that's the American thing. Let's just imagine an archetype from another country. Let's ask a 70-year-old Italian who's going out for lunch in Rome. What does he want from his food? What he wants from his food is he wants to sit down at a restaurant for 2 hours, and he wants to eat local food, traditional food, really tasty food. He might even want to have a glass of wine with his lunch, and he's going to sit there and enjoy a nutritionally dense, traditional, beautifully flavorful, excellent experience. That's one model. The American model is I want to drive through a drive-through window and get something as fast as I can, as cheap as I can, so I can get back to my job. So you get the food that you ask for. If you want food that's going to take you 8 minutes to eat and it's going to cost you 99 cents, that's what the culture is going to provide. That's what we've decided. We've decided we want our food as cheap and as fast as possible. Americans spend less money per capita on their food than almost any culture in the world, which is a very strange phenomenon because we're one of the richest countries in the world, but we don't spend our money on food, we spend it on everything else. So will it buy an expensive car or an expensive house or expensive shoes or an expensive phone, but we won't buy expensive food? Now that's strange. Other cultures are not like that. That's number one. Number two is this system that we've been talking about, this industrial food system, is really good at making really cheap food because of all these, what they call these efficiencies of scale. Like when you have one factory that is cranking out billions of chicken nuggets, they can do that really cheap. And of course, the reason they can make cheap chicken nuggets is because the ingredients of those nuggets, which is chickens and then the feed the chickens are eating, are created by giant corporations. The giant corporations are receiving giant federal subsidies to create that kind of food. So the federal food dollars, tax dollars, that go into the food system are very disproportionately supporting giant agribusinesses to create food often at below the cost of production. In other words, like a corn farmer can grow corn cheaper, he can sell it for less money than he's making because he's getting federal subsidies to support it. So you have all this tax money supporting a calorie-dense, nutritionally empty food system because the government and these corporations have decided that cheap, fast food is the most profitable way for them to make money. So when you go to the supermarket and you can buy a 2-liter bottle of soda for like $1.80, it's not because that's a natural price. That is a price that is supported by federal money. So what are you going to do? You can buy a $1.80 2-liter bottle of soda, or you can buy a bunch of carrots for $3. Which one are you going to buy? Well, the government apparently wants you to buy the Coke because they're subsidizing. They're not supporting the carrots. So what do you get? You get a country that is habitually eating chicken nuggets, pizza, fast food, and soda, and therefore the national waistline is growing, the national diabetes rate is spiking, the national heart disease rate is spiking. Meanwhile, these organic farmers growing actually good nutritional food can't get a nickel. So I think it's worth thinking about where you spend your money. Like, don't buy cheap food. Cheap food is artificially cheap, and so-called expensive food is actually just honest food. Pay your farmers to grow good food and you will benefit yourself, you'll benefit them, you'll benefit the environment, everything will work. One of the things we've been talking about is the centralization of control, let's say, political control and also financial control of not just food, but of democratic systems. So one way that this whole thing has gotten so off the rails is that the companies and the industries that control it have such a disproportionate influence on the American mindset through advertising, through political lobbying, through getting their people appointed to various offices, that the control of the free flow of information is really radically compromised. So one of the fundamental parts of a functioning democracy is the capacity of people to get information that is useful to them. So speaking as a journalist, journalism has that as a fundamental bedrock belief that anytime information is being controlled, it's a bad thing. It's a bad sign. It means that somebody's got an interest in controlling information. So there are fewer and fewer places where you can get deep access to information. One of the places is a very small and shrinking number of newspapers. One of the places is a small and shrinking number of magazines. The internet is very complicated because there is some good information and there's a lot of bad information. So a conference like The Real Truth About Health, in its effort to bring credible researchers and journalists and scientists together under one roof, is that they are able to get kind of a direct access to people without other things kind of coming in and refracting the information somehow. So, I go to conferences quite a bit as an academic, as a journalist, and this is where you get direct information from people. And it's a really useful thing. This is not an academic conference. This is a conference for regular people. Regular people don't have the luxury of going to academic conferences or medical conferences because they're not part of the profession. So this is a nice way to get, credible researchers and scientists and journalists directly in contact with actual people, which is really that's striking a blow for democracy. That's like getting people the information that they need. And we could use a lot more of that.